We sometimes forget that our practice is a practice of not two. This is the summation of the third ancestor's unbelieving mind. But not two is sometimes on the edge of being unbearable. Unbearable to be this moment, this body-mind universe that is our life. And yet, our vow, if we use that word, is being just this moment. It's being accepting, embracing what we might even call the burden of the unbearable. How do we, in a sense, keep renewing our vow, which is what the four practice principles sum up, the vow of being just this moment as is, so-called inside, so-called outside. As some of you may know, my first Zen teachers were Soa Nakagawa Roshi and his disciple Eido Shimano Roshi. Soa Nakagawa Roshi was a Rinzai Zen master, abbot of Ryutakuji, and before that, a practitioner at Ryutakuji. So I want to begin with several poems of his because he was a great haiku poet, possibly, it's been said, the best in the 20th century, though his poems, his haiku and other poems were just published in private printings with limited circulations. In the spring of 1943, he was living on Mount Daibosatsu in Japan. It's a forested, uninhabited mountain, which there's a shrine there dedicated to great Bodhisattva. That's why it's called Mount Daibosatsu, Mount Great Bodhisattva. Some people say Vairocana Buddha. And their regular services there once a month. People come up to the mountain. But otherwise, it's a forested mountain, and he would go on long retreats in the forest by himself. He was connected to a master teacher, Genpo Yamamoto Roshi, but most of Soen, no, I shouldn't say most, much of Soen Roshi's practice was solo retreats, living in the forest, gathering whatever food he could from the nuts from the trees and whatever else he ate. So this is spring 1943, during the war in the Pacific, as it was called, he writes a short poem. I will read it in Japanese just so that you hear it, though my Japanese is terrible. It's a short haiku. Senka tada tera no shinde fumu bakari. In English, news of victorious battle. I just shuffle along in the mud at this spring temple. That's spring 1943. Spring 1944, he writes another haiku. Senka tada tera no shunde fumu bakari. News of a disastrous battle. I just shuffle along in the mud at this spring temple. I just shuffle along in the mud at this spring temple. These two, what's particularly interesting of these two haiku, for those who are interested in poetry, is that they sound exactly the same. And in fact, if you look at, they're of course written in Japanese, and the two poems, two haiku, are exactly the same except for one character. They even sound the same. So despite the fact that there's one character that's different, it's pronounced exactly the same. Senka tada tera, the first line, and there's just one character in there that's different. News of a victorious battle, news of a disastrous battle. Nevertheless, this practice of not to, this bearing this moment, embracing this moment as is, this living our vow, our practice vow, is shuffling along in the mud at this spring temple, sitting zazen right now in this body-mind universe. This is the endless, ongoing practice. Sometimes we think it's easy when everything's going great the way I want it. No, it's so difficult when it's not going the way I want it. Easy is difficult. Difficult is difficult. Yet easy is easy. Difficult is easy. And this is all together, just this, not two. That's exactly the Buddha's teaching of what our life is and our life opportunity as this universe right now. How do we do it? Always it's starting right here, how, where, this hearing, seeing, sitting, walking, this embodying the universe as our life. The Buddha's teaching is not for those who are having everything easy. Of course it is, but it's far from limited to that. As all of you, well, maybe not all of you, but as I've mentioned often, there's a story of a woman who had a child, an infant, who died, and she was overrun by grief. She could not stop her grieving over it, her wailing. This is tremendously painful. Our own body child is dead, alive and now dead. And finally, her family said to her, because they couldn't take her anymore, they couldn't take her grieving, she wouldn't be consoled. She said, go, there's this guy called Shakyamuni who teaches in the forest. He has this magical formula to help revive children. She says, oh, he does. She was carrying around her dead baby. She would not release it. But so she ran to the Buddha with the baby, and she just ran to the front. She didn't let anyone else talk. There were others there. No, she just burst through and said to him, you must revive my baby. Bring the baby back to life. I've been told that you can do this. He says, oh, no, okay. But first he told her, you must do something. You must go to the village and bring me a seed. Some say a sesame seed, some say a mustard seed. Doesn't make a difference. A seed from a household that has never had anyone die there. And then I'll use that seed to revive your baby. I said, oh, yes. She said, yes, I'll do it. And she immediately ran off to the village and knocked on the door. Please, give me a sesame seed. They said, oh, of course. And they went to get it. And she says, but it's got to be from a household. No one died here, right? And they said, oh, well, someone did die in this household. Our father-in-law died. Oh, I can't take it here. So she went to the next house. Please, give me a sesame seed. Oh, yes, but no one died in this house, right? Well, our sister died here. Oh, no. And she goes from house to house to house in the village. Eventually, she goes to another village and does the same. And no matter where she goes, she finds that though they're willing to give her a sesame seed, there's always been someone in the family who died. And of course, families stayed in the same house over generation after generation. They didn't have any other house. Finally, she comes back to the Buddha, consoled in a way. He said, I've gone, Buddha, to all of these houses, and I found everywhere there are households where someone has died, where someone has had a disaster. And the Buddha, and she said, okay, I'm consoled. Where there's life, there's death. Where there's victorious battles, there are disastrous battles. And the woman eventually became a disciple of the Buddha and is one of the female ancestors of Buddha lineages. Um, you could look her name up and you could look at some of the poems she wrote. She became an arhat. Um, and there's a Therigatha. There's two collections of poems of early disciples of the Buddha. And in one collection is of the males, one collection is of the females. And in the women's collection, she has several poems. One could look that up if one were interested. The point is, just as the Buddha's decision, Shakyamuni's decision, or I should say Siddhartha, because that's who he was at that time, decision to begin practice has to do with seeing someone dying, before that seeing someone sick, seeing someone old, seeing people suffering in that way. And knowing that somehow, believing, seeing that there is a practice that deals with this unbearable burden, unbearable grief, unbearable whatever we want to call it, that grief, anxiety, there is practice which is designed to enable us to be just this moment, to go beyond what we like and dislike and want and don't want. And to know that these are all exactly part of being born. They're exactly part of form, sensation, conception, discrimination, awareness, being human in the universe, developing and being this capacity to bear this and then still maintain our vows of practice, our vows of liberating, so to speak, ourself and all beings from this unbearable burden called impermanence. It's not unbearable except that we don't want it. We want it to be the way we want it. Sometimes we get it, sometimes we don't. But it's not a matter of the words, it's a matter of how do I shuffle along in the mud at this spring temple, at this fall temple, at this zendo, at this moment my life, with this condition. Victorious, disastrous. How do I embrace my complaints and yet live no complaints? Embrace my wants and likes and dislikes and fears. How do we give ourselves no fear to embrace this moment? This was the practice that Soen Roshi taught. Soen Roshi exhibited in his own life with all sorts of conditions that are hard to bear, whether in terms of our own bodily conditions, the conditions of the world, conditions of the universe, conditions of the nation, of those that we love. Newborn baby, who can be more intimate to a mother than that? How do we bear this? Or just simply sitting upright, nothing particular happening, and yet our mind is running in all sorts of ways, caught in self-centered dreams. That's why it's so vital that we notice our thoughts so that we can use this experience of this bodily moment, use what's skillful to be this moment, to be this experience, to be thanks for everything, no complaints, despite the fact that I have endless complaints. It's goddamn, how could that happen? And yet, how do we bear the unbearable? How do we be this anxious sadness, grief, when that arises? How do we be simply this sitting upright when I had enough of this sitting? And yet, this is, how do I just shuffle along, kinhin, right now? Oh, enough of this, right now. How do we live not to is what every breath moment is the opportunity in Zazen. Is the opportunity in Zazen practice throughout the day, throughout the session, throughout the night, throughout our life. Not to close ourselves off, but just the opposite. Hear the news of this moment. And yet, we don't sit in the Zendo in order to cut off the world, but the whole world passes by, even just in the simple vroom of the cars that go by on the street, Green, on Prospect, who knows where. Who knows where? How do we take all of this as our opportunity of practice? Soen Roshi developed a practice from living on Mount Daibosatsu. He developed this practice of chanting Namu Daibo Sa, being one with the great Bodhisattva. Namu Daibo Sa. We could say becoming great Bodhisattva, but really it's being one as the great Bodhisattva that we are, even as we don't recognize it. Even as we don't recognize it. I remember this was probably 1980 or 1981. I was living with Maizumi Roshi as his attendant. And once he brought up, he had known Soa Nakagawa Roshi, even though he hadn't been his student or disciple, but he had done sesshin with him because of his teacher, Yasutani Roshi, was a friend of Soen Roshi's, and they used to do seshins together and do various other travels together. He's unsolicited by me. He brought up, he says, Soen Roshi, one of maybe the greatest Rinzai Zen teacher now in Japan. My own experience is that there was never a time when I was with Soen Roshi. I would just see him as I was a number of people who lived several blocks away from the Zendo in New York at that time, 2-3 blocks. And so I both did sesshin with Soen Roshi, and then often, usually I would be at this Zendo in the mornings between the sesshin, for morning Zazen, 5:30 in the morning, and then later in the day for work and evening. Soen Roshi always was practice, always use whatever opportunities we had, have whatever opportunities whoever showed up to support and encourage their practice, whether they were the first time, never came before, first time someone came who was in metal braces with polio injury to back and legs and was going into the hospital next day for a life-threatening surgery, how to help her then with the practice right then, always. I've told that story before, so I won't repeat it. How do we take the glorious victory, the terrible defeat, disaster as a part of our practicing this moment as Zazen, as shuffling along in the mud, as walking, as listening, as taking care of chopping these vegetables, as our life right here. That's our ongoing vow, our ongoing practice. So we have these few days of sesshin to practice together. Sitting Zazen, walking Kinhin, chanting, bowing, eating, resting, sleeping. Endless practice, endless vow of the simplicity of being the bodhisattvas that we are, being just this moment, just this experiencing. Thus, just this even grieving when that's there, just this joy when that's there, just this breath. Thank you.